The cease recorder at El Domingo signed weighed 11 grams and ended in Empire's advance. That is not a figure of speech. 3K, A, R VOHN. Logistics Analyst, 3rd VOHN Expeditionary Authority, pulled the original document from the engagement archive 14 months after the Carven Reach incident and had it physically weighed. 11.3 grams. Standard Mining Authority paper stock, her signature in blue ink at the bottom. The order itself was 3 lines. They authorized the cessation of drilling operations across all Carven Reach extraction sites, effective immediately, pending environmental compliance review. Standard bureaucratic language, the kind of form filed 800 times a week across human colonial space without anyone noting it, archiving it, or caring about it at all. What happened in the 6 minutes after that signature is still, technically, classified by 3 separate governing bodies. 3KKRVOHN is not bound by those classifications. 3KKRVOHN left the 3rd Expeditionary Authority's employ 11 months ago, and the records, as they have been curated, do not say what 3KRVOHN saw in them. This account exists because the records will not tell you. The mining bay on the Pale Lantern smelled of coolant and fractured silicate dust, a combination that 3KKRVOHN, reviewing the sensory logs from the bay's environmental monitors, could only approximate as something between industrial cold and the dry sharpness of stone just broken open. The bay was its El Domingo's assigned workspace for the final 11 days of the Carven Reach operation. Her personal mining lance MK-IV, charge cell full, barrel scratched along the left grip from 14 years of use, sat on the bench beside her when the shift began. She set it there every morning. That detail appears in the environmental log as a positional notation object. Personal equipment. Bench surface, May 7. 14 years of positional notations, every single morning. 3KKRVOHN did not understand, at first, why that mattered. The part that took 14 years to build took 11 seconds to show. What happened in those 11 seconds is what this is really about. The drill in her hand had still been warm then 14 years before she set it down for the last time and signed her name to the end of a war no one had officially started. In the beginning, the work was real. Carven Reach was a genuine extraction operation, 17 colony settlements across 4 asteroid-dense transit corridors, the kind of region that made mining corporations sign long leases and build permanent infrastructure. The silicate yields were good. The ReactorCores installed across the refinery network were standard dual-rated industrial units, efficient, durable, and 3KKRVOHN noted in the engagement review, rated for both thermal extraction and directed energy output. Standard, dual-rated, both functions listed in the manufacturer specifications. No one in the VOHN Imperium's intelligence apparatus flagged that. Industrial equipment catalogs were not, traditionally, treated as threat assessments. Across Carven Reach's 17 settlements, the work continued. Haulers moved ore. Refineries processed it. Mining crews filed their end-of-shift paperwork with the kind of meticulous regularity that VOHN analysts, reviewing the records in the months before the seizure order was issued, found almost tedious. 847 cease work forms in the 72 hours preceding the engagement alone. 3KARVOHN found this figure in the pre-engagement intelligence summary. It had been highlighted. Someone had written next to it, in VOHN standard notation, low threat indicator population procedurally dependent. Compliance reflex confirmed. That assessment was filed. It was not questioned. The drill on its El Domingo's bench had accumulated 220 hours of logged operation by the time the VOHN Imperium issued the seizure order on Carven Reach. 3KKRVOHN calculated this later. For maintenance logs, it had been calibrated at the start of every shift. The calibration readings were consistent to within 4 decimal places across the entire period. A well-maintained tool, used by a careful operator. Nothing more. 3KKRVOHN added a time notation to that observation. 6:30 for PM7, unable to reconcile maintenance consistency with engagement outcome. Flagged for review. The review was never conducted. There was no one left in the 3rd Expeditionary Authority's Analytical Division who wanted to ask that question. 14 years before the engagement, in a planning facility that does not appear in any public record, and whose location 3KKRVOHN has declined to name in this account, someone made a decision. The decision was not about weapons. It was about specifications. Every piece of mining equipment ordered for Carven Reach, every hauler chassis, every refinery unit, Every reactor core, every drilling array would be engineered to a secondary specification, not a hidden one, not a secret one. The secondary specification was listed in the procurement documents, available to anyone who requested them, filed with the appropriate colonial infrastructure authorities, stamped, archived, and forgotten. The specification stated, in the dry language of equipment certification, that all power generation and directed energy equipment installed across carbon reach extraction sites was rated for dual-use industrial application. Dual-use, 2 words, sitting in a procurement document for 14 years. Nassim Bakhash was 40 years old when the carbon reach operation began its construction phase. He had been born in Tabriz, had studied orbital infrastructure engineering for 6 years, and had subsequently spent the better part of 2 decades overseeing foundry operations in environments where the margin for error was measured in fractions of a degree and the cost of a miscalculation was counted in lives. He was Faraz, by every account available to 3KKR, VO a careful man. He played correspondence chess paper notation, posted through the colonial mail system, games that lasted months. He kept his responses brief. One of those letters, recovered from the Colonial Postal Archive and reviewed by 3KRVOHN, contained the following line, buried between a comment on his opponent's pawn structure and a note about an upcoming equipment delivery. The new cores are in 3,400 units across the full network. Dual rated as Spec D. Yield should improve considerably. His chess partner's reply was about the pawn structure. 3K. RVOHN read that letter 4 times. 3,400 reactor cores. Dual-rated, installed across the refinery network of a civilian mining operation in a transit corridor that VOHN Imperium had, at that point, already identified as a future annexation target. The intelligence file on Carbon Reach had been open for 9 years before the seizure order was issued. Not once in those 9 years had anyone in the analytical division cross-referenced the equipment specification documents with the dual-use certification standards. The cores were not hidden. They were cataloged, publicly, in a document anyone could have requested. No one requested it. Haley Tewold had been among the VOH Imperium's own colonial development workers for 9 of those 14 years, not as a spy, not under a false name, but as a contracted infrastructure specialist working on VOHN-administered settlements in the Outer Carbon Corridor. She had come from Asmara. She wove textiles in the evenings, the kind of close work that requires patience and attention to structure, and she was, by the accounts of the colleagues 3KKR VOHN later interviewed, universally considered quiet, competent, and entirely unremarkable. She filed her reports on schedule. She attended the required briefings. She noted, in those reports, the refueling schedules of VOHN fleet vessels rotating through the outer corridor, not as intelligence, but as infrastructure data relevant to supply chain planning. Her reports were filed, archived, sent, through standard channels, to the Colonial Development Authority's Logistics Office. From there, through a routing path that 3KARVOHN spent 6 weeks reconstructing, those reports reached Nassim Bakhash's correspondence address on Carbon Reach, encoded in the supply chain footnotes, in the delivery windows, in the projected fuel consumption figures for vessels that would never need to know their own schedules had been compromised. 9 years. Every quarter, filed on schedule. Pavlin Marek had been detained for 8 years. The VOHN Imperium's Border Enforcement Division had arrested him on suspicion of tool smuggling mining Landsamk IP components. Specifically, moving through a transit corridor in quantities that exceeded personal use certification. The charge was not incorrect. The components were there. What the Enforcement Division had not been able to determine, across 8 years of detention, was where they were going, who had ordered them, or what they were for. They had offered him the interrogation compounds on the 3rd day. He had declined. This is noted in the detention file as subject uncooperative. Compounds refused. No information obtained. 8 years of entries. All substantively identical. 3KK RVOHN read the full file in a single sitting and found. In the final entry, a notation by the supervising officer recommendary, least pending review subject has demonstrated no ongoing intelligence value. He was released for months before the engagement at Carbon Reach. His name would appear in the preamble of the Carbon Concord. 3KK RVOHN did not understand why. At first, they detained Miner. 8 years of silence. His name, first in the list of acknowledged contributors to an accord that restructured the governance of 4 transit corridors. 3KK RVOHN added a notation. Night Well Vam 40 for Marek, Pavlin. No recorded dialogue during detention period. 8 years. No information obtained by VOH and enforcement. Significance of preamble placement unknown. Flagged. It was Counselor Drac Coulson who had provided the refueling schedules. Drac Coulson's species had maintained a marginal diplomatic presence in the outer carbon corridor for over a century, too small to be a threat, too established to be easily displaced, and possessed of an institutional memory that extended back through several previous VOHN annexation cycles. The contact had been made through an obsolete trade pigeon code that neither the VO systems nor most human communications authorities would have recognized as a language at all. 3KKR VOHN recognized it only because of an obscure posting 12 years earlier to a frontier station where the code had still been in occasional use. The message, when 3KAR VOHN decoded it from the signals archive, was 6 lines. 5 of those lines contained the refueling rotation schedule for the 3rd VOHN Expeditionary Fleet, accurate to within 6 hours across a 14-month projection window. The 6th line read, "You are not the first species they have done this to." It's El Domingo's logged response to that message, recovered from the same signals archive, was 11 words understood. Should I send confirmation in standard notation or local Carven time? For seconds of recorded silence from Drac Coulson's relay station. Then standard notation is sufficient. 3K, RVOR, reviewing this exchange for the 3rd time, found that the response gap for seconds on a near-instantaneous relay system had been automatically logged by the monitoring software as a transmission delay and filed accordingly. No analyst had noted it. No one had considered that a 4-second pause in a response from a species that communicated incompleted formal statements might indicate something other than signal lag. The cost of 14 years is not easily measured in equipment specifications or reactor core counts. 3KKR VOHN understood this only in retrospect, and only partially. What the records showed was the operational surface, the procurement documents, their maintenance logs, the correspondence chest letters, the quarterly infrastructure reports. What the records did not show could not show, because no one who knew had written it down, was what it cost to be. For 14 years. Exactly as small as the VOHN Imperium expected you to be. Nassim Bakhash had played chess by postal correspondence for 14 years because it gave him a reason to write letters that moved through the colonial mail system on a predictable schedule. He had not won a single game in that time. His chess partner, 3KK RVOHN later determined, was also a foundry overseer, also on Carven Reach, also filing dual-use procurement documents on a 14-year schedule. They had never discussed the operation in those letters. Not once. The pawn structures were real. The games were real. The patience required to play correspondence chess for 14 years without discussing the thing that occupied most of your waking hours was 3K, ARVOHN considered, a form of discipline that had no category in VOH and institutional assessment frameworks. Haley Tewold had woven textiles for 9 years in the evenings, in a room in a Visser settlement, while her quarterly infrastructure reports moved through standard channels toward Nassim Bakhash's correspondence address. The textiles were good. 3 of them had been purchased by the settlement's administrative office for display in the communal spaces. She had not discussed the operation with anyone in that settlement. She had not discussed it with the customs officer who checked her travel documents on 6 separate occasions. She had not discussed it with the VOHN Colonial Development Supervisor who reviewed her annual performance reports and, on 2 occasions, recommended her for commendation. The commendation certificates were in her personnel file. 3KAR VOHN found them there. By the time the VOHN Imperium issued the seizure order on Carven Reach, the 200 mining vessels operating across the 4 transit corridors had been, for varying periods between 2 and 14 years, mechanically capable of something other than mining. The drill arrays were rated for directed energy output. The hauler chassis carried reinforced structural framing at tolerances that no load would require. The reactor cores, all 3, 400 of them, dual-rated, publicly certified, filed and forgotten in procurement documents anyone could have requested, were at full operational capacity. Every end-of-shift cease work form filed by every mining crew across all 17 Carven Reach settlements carried, and the routing codes printed at the top of each page, a status notation. The notation system had been in use for 11 years. It had been reviewed twice by VOH and administrative inspectors during routine compliance audits. Both times, it had been assessed as a standard colonial record typing format and logged accordingly. It was the fleet's readiness reporting system. 847 cease work forms in the 72 hours before the engagement, every one of them reporting operational status, every one of them filed, stamped, archived, and read by exactly the people who needed to read them. The mining bay on the pale lantern smelled of coolant, and the drill on the bench had a full charge cell, and its El Domingo pulled her end of shift paperwork toward her and reached for her stylus. The refueling schedule counselor Drac Coulson had provided covered 14 months of VOHN fleet rotation through the outer Carven corridor. 3 KKR VOHN had memorized it. By the end of the engagement review, the way you memorize something that has already hurt you. The 3rd VOHN expeditionary fleet ran on a refueling cycle of 22 days. Every 22 days, between 30 and 40% of active vessels in any given corridor were simultaneously at reduced operational capacity, engines throttled, weapons systems in standby, crews on rotating rest rotation. It was an efficient system. It had been in use for 60 years without significant modification, because in 60 years no adversary had possessed both the intelligence to know the schedule and the capability to exploit it. Into that window, on the 4th day of the VOHN seizure orders enforcement period, the Pale Lantern and 11 other cargo haulers filed standard transit paperwork and moved into the outer corridor. Cargo manifests listed silicate ore, processed and pelletized. The transit authority logged them without review. Haulers moved through those corridors constantly. The paperwork was, as always, meticulous. The haulers positioned themselves at 7 specific coordinates across the corridor's transit grid. Those coordinates, 3K say, are VOIH and determined, corresponded exactly to the optimal sensor relay positions for a fleet-wide targeting network, not a weapons network, a targeting network. The distinction mattered, because targeting infrastructure was not listed in any VOHN restriction on civilian vessel equipment. It was not listed because no one had considered that civilian vessels would need one. The VOHN fleet sensor operators noted the haulers. They filed contact reports. The contact reports were assessed, reviewed against the cargo manifests, and marked as non-creating, or haulers. Meticulous paperwork, low threat indicator. At the 35% mark of the engagement timeline, one of the fleet's junior intelligence officers submitted a query to the analytical division. The query noted that the 7 hauler positions formed a geometric pattern consistent with a relay array configuration. The query was assigned a review priority of 4 out of 10. Priority for queries were addressed within 72 hours under standard protocol. The engagement lasted 11 seconds. That officer's query was still pending when it ended. 3 KKR VOHN found the unread query in the division's archive during the post-engagement review. It had been filed correctly, routed correctly, assigned correctly. It sat in a queue of 43 other priority for items, behind an assessment of agricultural export disputes in a different corridor and a routine review of colonial communication relay maintenance schedules. The VOHN Imperium's intelligence apparatus had, in every technical sense, functioned exactly as designed. On the morning of the engagement, Ms. El Domingo opened her locker, removed the mining lance MKIV, and ran a calibration check on the charge cell. The reading was full. She noted it in the equipment log. She closed the locker. She picked up her stylus. She pulled the end of shift paperwork toward her. The form at the top of the stack was a cease work order. Standard mining authority stock. 3 lines. Space for a signature at the bottom. She had signed forms like it 11,000 times. She signed this one without looking up. In blue ink. At the bottom of the page, in the same motion she had practiced, though she would not have used that word every working day for 14 years. The routing code at the top of the form was different from the standard format by a single character. 3KK or VOHN had identified this discrepancy during the document review. That single character, in the ceasework routing system used across all 17 Carven Reach settlements, was the activation flag. It had been embedded in the form template for 11 years. It had passed through to VOH and administrative compliance audits without detection, because the auditors had checked the routing codes against the standard colonial format list. And the list did not include Mining Authority ceasework codes, because Mining Authority ceasework codes were not considered relevant to a security audit. The form left its El Domingo's desk at 7:14 M33 local Carven time. By 7:14:40, across all 17 settlements and all for transit corridors, 1,200 mining vessels had received the activation signal through the ceasework routing network. The drill arrays on each vessel rated for directed energy output, dual certified, publicly documented in equipment catalogs. Anyone could have requested reconfigured from extraction angle to targeting angle. The haulers at the 7 relay coordinates completed the sensor network. The ReactorCores, all 400 of them, moved from extraction mode output to directed energy standby. 11 seconds. Not because the engagement lasted 11 seconds, because the VOH-10 fleet needed 11 seconds to assess what was pointed at them. Calculate that their fuel reserves placed 40% of their vessels below operational escape velocity, and transmit a request for communication to the nearest human colonial authority. The request was received by its El Domingo's communications console at 7:14 m51. She set the stylus down. Its El placed the hand drill in its locker and signed the cease work order. The drill went in first. Charge cell full. Barrel scratched along the left grip from 14 years of use. Positional notation in Base 7's environmental log reading object. Personal equipment. Locker. Secured for the first time in 220 hours of logged operation. Then the cease work order, the second one. The one that actually ended it, signed in the same blue ink. In the same motion. Authorizing cessation of all carbon reach extraction operations pending formal negotiation of terms. Standard bureaucratic language. Pavlin Marek had been out of VOHN detention for 4 months. He was, at the moment of the engagement, in a transit facility 3 corridors away, waiting for a connecting flight to carbon reach. He had no communication device. He had not been briefed on the timing. He learned what had happened from a public news relay in the transit facility's common area, the same way everyone else in that room learned it. He was 47 years old. He had kept silent for 8 years. He had no hobby to reach for in that facility waiting room. No chess game in progress. No textile work in a bag at his feet. He sat in a chair and watched the news relay and did not say anything, which was, by that point, the thing he was best at. His name would be first in the preamble of the Carbon Concord. 3KKR, VOHN did not understand why until much later. A man who had said nothing. For 8 years, 2 people whose entire institutional function was extracting information. His silence had not broken the operation. His silence had been the operation's proof of concept, the demonstration. Running lived for 8 years inside a Versailles and detention facility that the doctrine could hold even under maximum pressure. The preamble listed him first because, of everyone who had built the thing, he had paid the most to keep it quiet. 3KR VOHN's post-engagement report was submitted to the 3rd VOHN Expeditionary Authority 47 days after the Carbon Reach incident. It ran to 216 pages. The Analytical Division chief read the executive summary and filed the full report without comment. The report's conclusion section contained the following passage, which 3KK RVOHN wrote and rewrote 11 times before settling on the final version. The pre-engagement intelligence assessment classified the Carbon Reach civilian population as procedurally dependent, a population that would comply with process under duress and therefore pose no active resistance threat. This assessment was derived from observation of routine bureaucratic behavior, meticulous paperwork, consistent reporting schedules, high compliance rates with administrative requests. The assessment was not incorrect as an observation. It was incorrect as an interpretation. We read their compliance as submission. We did not consider that compliance could be a weapon. The paperwork was the operation. The cease work forms were the command architecture. The refueling schedule they had been collecting for 9 years through standard infrastructure reporting channels was the intelligence foundation of the engagement. Nothing in the pre-engagement file was concealed. Everything was filed. We did not read it correctly because we did not know what we were reading. 3KARVOHN added a time notation to the conclusion. To 22 p.m. 19, unable to identify the point at which this became unrecoverable. Flagged. No further review requested. The VOH Fleet's senior logistics commander, reviewing the engagement record independently, reached a different conclusion. His assessment, circulated internally and obtained by 3KRVOHN through channels that will not be specified here, contained one line that has remained in 3KKRVOHN's working memory since first reading it. They did not build a bigger weapon. They built a system that made our weapons irrelevant. The Carbon Concord was signed 49 days after the engagement. Its infrastructure equity clause guaranteed independent governance of all for carbon transit corridors, with a military disclosure requirement attached. Any armed force seeking transit through carbon space was required to file operational specifications with the Carbon Colonial Authority 60 days in advance. The military disclosure clause applied to all parties, including human colonial defense forces. It was 3KKR, VOHN noted. the only treaty clause that applied equally to the side that had just demonstrated it did not need to file anything because it had already filed everything. The Concorde's preamble listed 6 names. Pavlin Marek was first. Nassim Bakhash was second. Haley Tewald was fourth. Its El Domingo was last, which was, given that her signature had ended the engagement, either a statement of deliberate understatement or a joke that 3KARVOHN did not have the cultural context to parse. The Kars Drac Coulson's name was not in the preamble. The counselor had not requested acknowledgement. 3KARVOHN found a single line in the Concorde's supplementary notes. In the archaic trade pidgin that almost no one still read, assistance rendered. No debt incurred. Below it, in standard notation, a timestamp, no signature. 3KK. RVOHN recognized the timestamp format. It was the same one the VOHN Analytical Division used to mark unexplained observations. Someone had learned it from somewhere. 3KARVOHN chose not to investigate further. The Carvin Concorde's infrastructure equity clause was, within 18 months, cited as precedent in for other colonial governance disputes in adjacent corridors. None of those disputes involved a fleet engagement. In 3 of them, the citation alone was sufficient. The 4th required a negotiation period of 11 days, at the end of which the party contesting the governance arrangement withdrew its objection without public explanation. 3KARVOHN noted, in a private working file that has not been submitted to any authority, that the colonial authority in that 4th dispute had, during the 11-day negotiation period, filed a routine equipment certification renewal for its mining infrastructure. The certification listed dual-rated ReactorCores, standard industrial equipment, publicly documented. No one had requested it. 3KARVOHN had found it independently. 5 for PM55 flagged. No action recommended. Base 7 on the Pale Lantern was empty by the time its El Domingo walked it for the last time. The environmental monitors were still running coolant circulation, air recycling, temperature regulation, but the smell of fractured silicate dust was gone. Without active drilling operations, the particulate filters had cleared the air in 72 hours. What remained was recycled air with the faint metallic edge of the coolant lines, and the sound of the ship's ventilation moving through a space designed for 30 people and currently holding none. The bench where the mining lands MK had sat every morning for 14 years was clean. 3KARVOHN obtained access to the bay's environmental logs through the post-engage request and found, in the positional notation records, a gap. The last entry before the engagement read object, personal equipment, bench surface, May 7. The first entry after read object, personal equipment, locker, secured. Between those 2 entries, in the log's continuous timestamp record, 11 seconds of unrecorded time. The monitoring system had continued running. It had simply found nothing to note. Its El Domingo walked the length of the bay. Her footsteps were in the audio logged even pressure, consistent stride, no deviation from her standard transit pattern. She stopped at the workbench. She stood there for 44 seconds, which the environmental monitor logged as subject stationary. Bay 7, workbench position. Then she continued to the locker. The locker's seal indicator showed green. Secured. Inside, the mining lance MK IV sat in its rack, charge cell at full capacity, barrel scratched along the left grip. The equipment log's final entry for that unit read status operational. Last use calibration check. 7:14 AM31. Next scheduled use pending operational review. Pending operational review. The drill had been operational for 220 hours. It had fractured rock faces in 7 different asteroid fields across 3 transit corridors. It had been calibrated at the start of every shift. Maintained to within 4 decimal places of consistent performance. Carried in the same hand through every working day of an operation that had lasted longer than some small wars. It had a full charge cell. It had never been fired in anger. The 200 ships that had ended the VOHN advance had carried drill arrays capable of directed energy output, and not one of them had discharged a single watt at a VOHN vessel, because the VOHN vessels had requested communication before there was anything to discharge at. The locker closed. 3KARVOHN's final report contained 216 pages. On page 216, after the conclusion and the time notation in the recommendation section that recommended nothing specific, there was one line that had not been requested by the analytical division and that 3KARVOHN had not been able to leave out. Yet we were ready for war. The readiness was not the achievement. The Pale Lantern's environmental monitors continued their cycle, coolant through the lines. Air through the filters. The locker sealed. The bench empty. The bay running on the same schedule it always run on. Because the monitoring systems did not know the operation was over, no one had filed the paperwork to tell them. Outside the viewport at the far end of Bay 7, the Carven Reach transit corridor held its 4 asteroid fields, 17 settlement lights, and the slow transit of our haulers moving through space on meticulous schedules, filing their paperwork on time, their routing codes printing at the top of every form in a format that anyone could have requested and almost no one had ever read.